Welcome, star people. This is another episode of the Outlaw Astrology Podcast. I am your intrepid star guide and cosmic detective, APM. And today we are diving into the fascinating world of criminal astrology. And before we begin, a trigger warning. It is possible we are discussing themes related to criminal behavior. Not too much this episode, however. If you find that activating, remember to take care of yourself and step away if needed. Some quick housekeeping. If you like what you're hearing, like, share, and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, and in particular, Spotify and Apple iTunes. Also, if you like what you're hearing, don't forget to check out our daily stargazing newsletter for your personal cosmic updates and insights. And with that, on with the show. So, what is criminal astrology? So what we're going to do today, because I've given us case histories to look at, criminal astrology is a new, shiny thing that has just come up in the astrology field. Because astrology can literally be used to look at, to understand, and to navigate any topic pretty much that you can possibly conceive of. So criminal astrology has its origins and connections in psychological astrology. And what psychological astrology is what people consider to be modern astrology. A side note, I do not believe modern and psychological astrology are the same thing. Modern astrology includes the use of modern essential dignities, which include outer planets, which are like Uranus, Pluto, Eris, and even Ceres, which is a minor planet that exists in the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter. So it's the inclusion of those planetary bodies and also the points of adding the North Node and Black Moon Lilith. That's modern astrology to me. It's eclectic. It takes what exists traditionally and adds upon it. Whereas psychological astrology is using the chart to better understand people, in particular yourself, or maybe that colleague, sibling, parent, spouse, or other that you don't understand well. It's an opportunity to look more deeply and understand them. So psychological astrology is what most people understand astrology to be. It is, well, you have a sun in Capricorn, and so you are more goal-focused, disciplined-oriented, earth sign, like to initiate sort of idea. That is psychological astrology at work. Now, I am not against psychological astrology. I think it serves a purpose. It's very useful when you're trying to understand yourself, when you're faced with all of the opinions from other people and you want to better understand yourself from your own opinion. Side note on that, I do not believe it is possible for other people to know you as well as you know you. You know yourself the best. Even if other people have ideas, even if they grew up with you, even if they have lived with you for a fair enough time, like, several years, you still have the inside track. What they're offering up are opinions based on the version of you that exists in their heads. That doesn't mean it's inaccurate, but it does not mean it's 100% objective or 100% accurate, because other people's opinions, even if they're third party, are still subjective opinions, because people, like us, bring alongside them their own biases, their own pet peeves, and their own logical fallacies and anathemas with them, which inform, alongside their emotions, their any opinions, beliefs, and worldviews they might hold. So, psychological astrology is useful. You just simply do not take it as if it were destiny or fate, because your choices and your understanding of yourself is prioritized always, in my opinion. Okay, so the role of birth charts in understanding criminal behavior is very simple. You can simply draw up a chart on someone who's created a criminal act and use psychological astrology with some alterations to better understand that person. Now, what you are doing is still speculating, and that's basically what you do with pretty much any older personality quiz or program, it doesn't matter which. Either way, you're still speculating. So these are speculations on what could be at work, what could be possible. The whole point is to have something to grab onto, to sink your teeth into, so you can better understand criminal behavior, in particular the person who created the behavior. Because if you understand what forces were at work or what issues they might be dealing with, it makes it easier to understand the behavior. Another point for me is understanding is meant for me to be more compassionate, to say, okay, I understand you had a crap childhood, which led you to make some pretty disastrous choices, socially inappropriate choices, meaning, harming other people is considered a socially inappropriate choice. One would even say antisocial, okay? So one's childhood upbringing and caretaking, nurturing and thriving and all that will have a good effect or for an ill effect on people. Very rarely is it neutral. So you can use a birth chart in modern astrology, in that you're using Pluto, Uranus, etc., and then you can add that to that psychological astrology so that you can get into the interior of people. Now, what you have to consider, like I said, is that we are not here to divine how other people are. Now, one of my challenges with astrology, if it's just psychological, is you're attempting to cold read people and divine them. And I do not believe that whilst it's useful for people to offer up a differing opinion of how they view me, it's interesting, it only serves to sharpen the knife of my own understanding of myself, so that I can be more clear. And if I'm clear, I can navigate the world better, because I could say, yes, I agree with that, that's interesting, I want to consider that as part of my story, or no thank you, I don't want to consider that part of my story, because I already know myself well enough to know that I would never do that or not be interested in that. So the ethical considerations are as follows. You're always going to lean toward that person's life experience and understanding when doing a reading. You never, ever, ever say, this is this is fixed, absolute, and cannot be altered. That is nonsense. Change is the only constant in the cosmos, so one must always err on the side of, if you're doing a reading, even a criminal reading, you're speculating, this is alleged, and you're divining this person's interiority. And the only person that has the inside track on that will be the criminal themselves, or the victim themselves, or any parties involved in said crime themselves. What you're doing is speculating. It is not fixed. It is not absolute. It is not inherently 100% truthful. It is simply an added opinion, an added point of view, an added view that could color the context and offer us up more options. Okay? And so we're going to step into now the houses of criminal behavior. All right? So the houses of criminal astrology are not that different as regular astrology. It uses the same housing systems. There are 12. I am going to do a quick overview. I am not going to stop excessively. I'm simply going to lay it out as simply as possible, so as to say, in line with the timing constraints that I've set forth for today's episode. So starting with the first house represents the victim's physical appearance and demeanor, initial discovery of the crime, the first responders to the crime, and immediate environment where the crime occurred. The second house is stolen items, financial motivation, evidence left at a crime scene, financial status of a victim, or material aspects of an investigation. So I'm more likely to look at the second house, and I know I said I wouldn't do this, but a brief caveat, I'm less likely to look at evidence at a crime scene in the second house per se, but it is something I will consider. The third house is witness statements, local media coverage, in particular, transportation used in the crime, especially if it's local, and communication between perpetrator and victim and perpetrator and press. The fourth house is the victim's home life, the crime scene, if it's in a residence, in particular, the residence of the victim and family dynamics. The fifth house is romantic motivation, victim's social life, recreational activities leading to the crime, risk-taking behavior, and, speculation, basically. So that, in addition to that, I would also say about speculating behavior. The sixth house is the victim's daily schedule, forensic evidence, investigative procedures, and health aspects of the crime. The seventh house is the perpetrator, known enemies of the victim, public's perception of the suspect, and the relationship between victim and perpetrator. The eighth house is the cause of death, hidden motives, psychological profile of the killer, and transformation of the evidence, meaning anything having to do with something burnt, waterlogged, or in any way meant to bury those traces of evidence so that the killer cannot be found. Okay, so it's the attempt to kind of hide things. The ninth house is the jurisdiction issues, long-distance aspects of a crime, crimes that happen on foreign soil or from a distance from the local scene of the victim. So if the victim lives in Kalamazoo and the crime occurs in San Diego, that's far enough away to be called long distance because the victim does not normally frequent San Diego. Okay, so that would be considered a ninth house issue. Legal proceedings involving the crime of philosophical and religious motivations. The 10th house is law enforcement, authority figures, public reaction to the crime, whether or not the crime is public, because not all crimes receive the same amount of publicity, so the publicity around the crime, career-oriented motives, and status of investigation. The 11th house is group involvement, and that would mean, like, say, Jonestown, the Manson family, those type of crimes, you would definitely look at the 11th house because they were community-oriented. So when you see a cult and any crimes involved in cults, you're looking at the 11th house because that is most certainly group involvement. Social media impact, if any, community response, and any future preventive measures, but also future impact. The 12th house represents undiscovered evidence, buried evidence, unconscious motives, secret enemies, institutional involvement, imprisonment, and things of that, and also withdrawal, retreat, things of that nature. So those are the houses and what they particularly represent. Now, the key houses that we're going to be looking at typically in criminal astrology is the 6th, the 8th, and the 12th. And so when you're looking at the 12th house, starting with the 12th, we're looking at undiscovered evidence, unconscious motivations, secret enemies, and institutional involvement, but also whether or not the victim could have been kidnapped and held against their will. You'd be looking in the 12th house for that, for example. So you want to definitely know unconscious motivations, and detectives and crime scene investigators are always looking at unconscious motives in addition to, that's what profilers do, and undiscovered evidence. Because sometimes you're going to need to divine what is going on based on what you see and also what you do not see. The 8th house is cause of death, hidden motive, psychological profile of the killer, and transformation of evidence, meaning attempts to hide one's identity. That would be transformation. That would be burning, burying, hiding, that sort of thing, cleaning up after oneself, that sort of thing, so as to hide one's identity and the facts of the crime. And that's why the 8th house is important, because you're also looking at, like I said, cause of death. That's where you're going to look in the 8th house, and that is why it is a focus in criminal astrology. Now, the sixth house is the daily schedule of the victim. You're always going to want a timeline of what happened in the crime. What was the victim doing? What was their day-to-day schedule like? Who did they interact with? Who did they talk to? Who was close to them? Who wasn't close? That sort of thing. And whenever you watch, say, for example, you're a fan of Law & Order, which I am, and by the way, we do have a killer Law & Order UK version, but they're always going to show you the timeline. Okay, what happened on that day? What was the natural routines of the victim? Because this will help you get an idea. Okay, if they constantly came in contact with this grouping in this neighborhood, now they know they don't have to look 12 blocks over. They don't have to look in a totally different city. They know it's right here in this neighborhood, and more than likely the perpetrator lives here as well, which narrows the search quite a bit. And so forensic evidence can be found, investigative procedures, health aspects of the crime, because was it a crime of mercy, for example? So this is why these would be very important aspects of the crime to look at, and these are why these are the three most important houses. They are by no means the only aspects of the crime you should look at, or aspects of the chart you should look at. They're simply primary focuses. Okay, so we're going to look next at planetary influences, and by that we're looking at the planets. What do the planets mean? That sort of thing. So let's look at that. So the sun represents the core nature of the crime and the most visible aspects. It is also the male perpetrator. The moon represents emotional aspects of the crime, the timing of events, the public's emotional response, and that depends on aspect and house placement. Fluctuating evidence, meaning that we thought it was this, now it's suddenly that, because now we have new facts. The cyclical nature of crime and criminal behavior, because people's emotions shift. That's why emotions are represented by the moon, because emotions never stay static most of the time. Even though we might believe they do, they don't. They shift in and out of form. Okay, that's why the moon represents emotion in a crime, and it's also the victim, particularly if the victim is female or identifies as a femme. And that's the same for the perpetrator. If the perpetrator identifies as male, you're going to use the sun to symbolize them in a criminal chart. Now, Mercury represents communication patterns, written evidence or documents about the crime involving the crime, witness testimonies, and investigative thought processes. Okay. Venus could definitely represents relationship dynamics. That would be relationship between perpetrator and victim, if any, or any other people involved in the crime who could have information that would help the solving of said crime. Valuable items involved, artistic or aesthetic elements of the crime. For example, when looking at the Manson family crime, you definitely want to consider Venus. Now, why am I saying that? Is because the motivation for those crimes, even though there was, a dystopian idea of what the future would look like, the motivation that most people never notice or talk about was revenge. Manson was rejected and thwarted in his desire to be a songwriter and a musician. And he did not take it well when he got rejected, and so some of those crimes were actually him exacting revenge on the people who got in the way of what he wanted, which was to be a successful musician. Okay, so I would look at Venus to see how well Venus performed in his chart, whether by essential dignity aspect or house placement, it was a healthy Venus, and how it could have affected those events that led to the deaths of all of those people in a crime spree in 1969 and then the trial in 1970, okay? And so also social connections, which I would also look at by house and aspect placements. Now, Mars, violent aspects of the crime, the weapons used, particularly if those weapons are made of steel, if they're bullets, guns, or projectiles, that's very Mars-type energy, aggressive, behaviors, confrontational situations, and motivations of the crime. If it is an aspect to Mercury, I would look at, explosives also, because Mercury, if put in say we're investigating the criminal astrology chart of a bombing, and a Mercury switch was used, Mars in aspect to Mercury would be the thought process, but it would also give you an idea. A Mercury switch on a bomb is highly unstable, and a person who puts such a bomb together would be a very meticulous and patient person with very rock-steady reflexes, because you would have to. If you tilted, and I know I'm getting off point, I know I said I wouldn't, but this is the Outlaw Astrology Podcast, and I'm the Outlaw Astrologist, so here we are. If you tilt a Mercury bomb in any which way, it could make it unstable and highly explosive. So someone who would use that trigger, for example, that would give you a supreme indication of who they are, because the stuff that people use, whether it's a bomb, whether it's a knife, whatever the weapon is, tells you something about the perpetrator of the crime, okay? So motivations of the crime, confrontational situations, aggressive behaviors, and things of that nature would be Martian. Did the victim and the perpetrator have an aggressive confrontation before the crime occurred, for example? Chiron represents traumatic patterns in the victim and the perpetrator. Healing aspects needed for resolution and vulnerable points in investigation. For example, if the crime is motivated by otherism, meaning that this is a hate crime, I would look to Chiron for that. Okay? Jupiter represents the expansion of criminal activity, the legal system's involvement, excessive or grandiose criminal behaviors or ideas around those behaviors, and international aspects of investigation. I would also look to belief systems, especially if Jupiter and Mercury are having a chat in that particular chart. Saturn represents limitations in the investigation, time delays, cold cases, structured criminal operations, and authority figures involved in the crime. Because sometimes the criminal is someone in a place of authority. Maybe they're an attorney, a police officer, someone associated with the law enforcement realm. They could be a member of law enforcement. Crimes have been committed by such people. Uranus could represent sudden breakthroughs in the case, unexpected evidence or discoveries, technological aspects in the crime, disrupted investigation patterns, a shocking and unexpected crime, for example. So if a crime comes out of the blue and no one saw it coming, it would be underneath Uranus. That's where you'd look. You'd look at Uranus by house, by aspect, and by essential dignity to see how Uranus is functioning, to give you any indications about this crime. Neptune represents deception, false leads, drug-related aspects, confusion in witness accounts, and also I would look to confusion in, if the perpetrator has been interviewed, any confusion in their accounts, and illusions created by the perpetrator, because they're trying to get, it's a glamour, they're trying to get away with the crime, not get caught, you understand? So Pluto represents power dynamics in crime, hidden criminal networks, transformative evidence, and deep psychological motivations. Eris represents discord among investigators, competitive criminal elements, chaos created by crime, disrupted social order, and also retribution. So if I'm looking for revenge or retribution, a crime based on revenge, I'm going to look at Eris. I'm going to look at Ceres when I want to look at, how resources, because if you're looking at how things are motivated, Ceres in a chart usually tells you about the resources and tells you, gives you a little bit more of an indication on how the person might use their resources, and also has to do with nurturing. particularly nurturing from a caretaker, how well, how healthy or unhealthy. It also could speak to the victim if it is in aspect to the moon. And if it's an aspect to the sun, it tells you about the perpetrator. And that is what we have for the aspects of the planets. So, that's what we have so far. And let me now move on to some other points that I'd like to share, just in case. So, by no means are we saying absolutely, since criminal astrology is shapeshifty, astrology is shapeshifty. The reason why, and I'm sorry, I am having a really bad sinus day today. The weather is just making my sinuses really act up today, so I do apologize for all the sniffling. Ooh, I'm trying to keep myself clear-headed, but I'm having a difficult time. So, these are so far what criminal astrology is like. Now, astrology is very fluid and shape-shifty. The reason why it has survived for thousands of years, at least 2,500 years plus, is because of its ability to shape-shift. Every civilization who encountered astrology used what existed previously when they could, and when they couldn't, added to it, added their own flavor, their own perceptions, their own worldview, based on where they were in time and at that time. So medieval astrologers would have had a vastly different point of view than early Egyptian, Babylonian, and Greek astrologers, and even Roman astrologers. So this is a new field that's emerging because we're very fascinated by psychology. It's not to say that psychology did not exist back then. It most certainly did. We just didn't codify. We didn't research. We didn't take notes, or at least we don't have access to those notes, and so had to start over. In about the 19th century, all of child psychology and psychology of criminals and people started to really take hold when we had both Jung and Freud, for example, and by no means are they the only ones. There are many, 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 many other practitioners out there that were influencing and were influenced by them, and that is the reason why you don't see a lot of psychological astrology previous to about the 19th century. That was the 19th century's contribution in addition to a spiritualist vibe, because at that point, people were less interested in the interiority of other people and more interested in what was going on out there. So astrology was used to define or divine whether or not the ruler should go to war, marry this person, have this child, and do this thing. At that point in history, most people did not have viable, easy to gain access to and memorize, etc. They didn't have birth certificates in hand. So they either you had to sort out what the midwife thought when she looked up at the sky or what have you to divine, okay, midday, noon, sunset, early morning. You're pretty much going to get, that's pretty much what it was going to be. You're not likely to have it even that level of pinned down for most people, because that was only done for people of, royalty, noble birth, personages of some public status and privilege, okay? And so you're not likely to see that. That's why you're not likely to see it before the 19th century. And when psychology came in, people became very fascinated about the interiority of people, and that is when we have the advent and eventually the full explosion and bloom of psychological astrology. Okay, so the key takeaway here, star people, is that criminal astrology is a tool for understanding. It is not a judgment, and it's not chaining us to a horrid fate. We are speculating, we are divining, but we must always remember to be respectful of the people, the victim, perpetrator, and other people affected by the crime and investigating the crime, when we discuss criminal astrology, because some of these events are very painful and can activate strong emotions in other people. And so we have to be mindful of that whenever we can, and when it's necessary, which is always, and appropriate, which is always. So, until next time, please feel free to join me, 8 p.m. in part 2 of this fascinating subject. You can find us on Cosmic Corners and Spaces for daily updates. Once again, the daily Stargazer newsletter does that sort of thing. It gives you the stars in your hands. I do it every day, so if that's your sort of thing that you're interested in, please sign up. There is both a free and paid version. Currently you can just sign up for free and you get a taste of what I do. And the paid versions will be coming shortly in the near future. Thank you very much for listening. Peace and astro magic, star people. Until next time, keep your feet on the ground and your eyes to the skies.